When the husband said he was going on a business trip, the wife decided to take a solo trip. When she came back home, her legs trembled at what she saw. Sarah and David, a loving couple, faced the ups and downs of a relationship. She, a lover of freedom, he, a dreamer of a family. A shocking revelation, a little girl who could change everything. Sarah and David are about to face the greatest test of their lives. Sarah and David met during their first year of college, an encounter that would mark the beginning of a lasting friendship and, eventually, a romantic relationship. David was known for his outgoing and enthusiastic personality, always the first to suggest a new adventure or organize social gatherings. He was the kind of person who stood out in a crowd, not just because of his height and messy blonde hair, but also for his contagious energy. In contrast, Sarah preferred the quiet of libraries and the coziness of cafes. With her long brown hair and observant eyes, she was a serene figure, devoted to her literature studies with an almost religious passion. Despite these differences, or perhaps because of them, David and Sarah quickly became friends. "Have you ever read The Great Gatsby?" Sarah asked in one of their first conversations, curious about David's interest in literature. "Not yet," he replied with a mischievous smile. "But if you recommend it, I'll read it." That exchange marked the start of an ongoing dialogue between them, exploring worlds that were previously unknown to each other. Their friendship blossomed and, over time, transformed into something deeper. Sarah and David shared secrets, dreams, and even fears. "Sometimes I feel like I always have to be the fun guy," David confessed one night as they walked around campus. "But with you, I can just be myself." Sarah smiled, touched by his honesty. "And I love that part of you too," she replied, feeling closer to him than ever. After a few years of dating, they decided to get married. The ceremony was a reflection of everything they stood for, an intimate celebration, surrounded only by their closest friends and family. David, in a dark blue suit, and Sarah, in a simple lace dress, were glowing. "Today, we are not just celebrating the love of two people, but the union of two souls that complete each other," the priest said during the ceremony. His words were met with applause and tears of joy. During the toast, David's father joked, "You two are like fire and water, but somehow together, you create steam." Everyone laughed, recognizing the truth in his observation. The first years of marriage were challenging, especially financially. David was just starting his career at an engineering firm, while Sarah worked as a junior editor at a small publishing house. "Remember when we had to choose between buying food or paying the bills?" David laughed, recalling the tough times. "And we ended up eating instant noodles for a week," Sarah added, smiling. Despite the hardships, they always found a way to support each other. "What matters is that we're in this together," Sarah would say, and David always agreed. One topic that frequently came up in their conversations was the question of having children. David had always had a clear image in his mind of fatherhood. "I'd love to teach my child to ride a bike, just like my dad taught me," he'd say, with a dreamy expression. Sarah, on the other hand, was more reserved on the subject. "I love our life just the way it is," she'd say cautiously. "We have so much freedom to do what we want." She feared that the arrival of a child might change the dynamic that she so valued in their marriage. This difference in opinion started to create a subtle tension between them. David tried not to show his disappointment, but Sarah noticed it in small gestures, like the distant look he got when he saw a family playing in the park. "He's thinking about it again," she thought, feeling powerless to change her own feelings. As this issue loomed over them, Sarah began to wonder if this disagreement would one day become an insurmountable barrier. The uncertainty about the future began to weigh more heavily on Sarah. Despite their frank discussions, she felt that David's desire to be a father was a constant shadow over their relationship. "What if he ends up blaming me for not wanting children?" she wondered, lying awake at night. The tension grew when David announced a business trip to Seattle. "It's a great opportunity to expand our connections in the industry," he explained, excited. Sarah tried to smile, but anxiety bubbled beneath the surface. With David away, Sarah found herself sinking into negative thoughts. Every text or video call was met with a mix of relief and doubt. What if he meets someone who wants the same things he does? Fear began to consume Sarah, leading her to consider the unthinkable. "I'll visit Emily in Portland," she told David, hiding her true plan to stay in town and watch him from a distance. At the hotel, Sarah spent hours scrolling through David's social media, looking for any sign of betrayal. "I'm being irrational," she thought, but she couldn't stop. Every photo or post he made was scrutinized for hidden clues. Her paranoia grew, fueled by her own insecurity. Why did he take that picture with that colleague, she wondered, increasingly uneasy. During a walk in the park, Sarah tried to clear her mind. "I need to trust him," she told herself, but the panic was hard to control. She sat on a bench, watching the families around her, children running and laughing. "Am I being selfish for not wanting kids?" she thought, biting her lip. The uncertainty about her own future and the future of her marriage left her feeling anguished. That afternoon, while sipping coffee, Sarah decided she needed to stop. "I'm torturing myself for no reason," she thought, but the doubt persisted. She considered calling David to confess everything, but the shame was too great. "How can I explain what I'm feeling?" She knew her insecurities were irrational, but the fear of losing David felt all too real. On the day of David's return, Sarah decided to go home early, hoping to find some peace. However, when she opened the door, she was met with a scene she never expected. David was on the living room floor, happily playing with a little girl. "Who is this child?" Sarah thought, her heart racing. The girl, with her curly hair and innocent smile, seemed completely at ease. The sight triggered a whirlwind of emotions in Sarah, including a sharp, crushing pain. "Does he have a daughter?" The thought hit her like a punch. Sarah felt the ground collapse beneath her feet. How could he hide this from me? A torrent of questions flooded her mind. She took a deep breath, trying not to break down. "David, what's going on here?" Her voice came out louder and higher than she intended. Anger and confusion mingled as she tried to make sense of the situation. David, clearly surprised by Sarah's sudden arrival, quickly stood up. "Sarah, I can explain," he began, but she cut him off. "Who is this child? How could you betray me like this?" The pain in her voice was palpable. The little girl looked at them, confused, not understanding the tension in the air. David took a step towards Sarah, but she backed away, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. "There's nothing to explain," Sarah shouted, her voice cracking. "You lied to me. How could you?" David tried to get closer, his eyes pleading. "Please listen to me," he begged. "This is Lizzie, my niece Emily's daughter. She asked me to take care of her for a few hours while she dealt with a medical emergency." He reached out, trying to touch Sarah, but she backed away again. Sarah looked at the girl, who now seemed nervous, and then at David. "Why didn't you tell me?" She felt a mix of relief and shame, but the pain of her suspicions still lingered. "Because I knew you were feeling insecure about the trip," David replied, with a calmness that Sarah found infuriating. "I didn't want to worry you more than you already were." He took a step back, trying to give her some space. David continued, now calmer. "Sarah, I would never hide something like this from you," he said, his voice firm. "When Emily called me, I just wanted to help. I didn't think it would be a problem since you were away. And I was going to tell you everything as soon as you got back." Sarah felt a wave of shame mixed with relief. "So, Lizzie isn't your daughter?" she whispered, hardly believing the confusion she had created in her mind. David shook his head with a sad smile. "Of course not. I would never hide something like that from you," he repeated. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to process the situation. Little Lizzie, unaware of the adult drama, continued playing, now with the stuffed animal David had given her. The contrast between the child's innocence and Sarah's emotional turmoil was almost unbearable. Feeling weak, Sarah sat down on the couch. "I'm so sorry," she said, looking at David with tear-filled eyes. "I let my insecurity take over. I was so afraid of losing you that I started imagining things that weren't real." David slowly approached, sitting next to her. "Sarah, I understand," he said gently. "I know the subject of having kids is complicated for us. But none of this changes how I feel about you, David said, his voice steady. He took Sarah's hands, looking her in the eyes. I love you, and nothing will ever change that, he affirmed, with a certainty that Sarah desperately needed to hear. She closed her eyes, feeling the tears flow, this time out of relief. I love you too, she murmured, holding David's hands tightly. The weight of the misunderstanding began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of reconnection. The rest of the day was spent talking about their fears and insecurities. I've always felt guilty for not wanting children, Sarah confessed, while David nodded, listening attentively. But I never wanted to pressure you, he responded. I want us to be happy together, regardless of how we decide to live our lives. They promised to be more open with each other, recognizing that communication was the key to overcoming their differences. After the incident with Lizzie, Sarah and David decided they needed to work harder on their communication and trust in their relationship. Let's try to be more transparent about our feelings, David suggested as they walked through the park. Sarah agreed, knowing they had much to discuss about the future. And that includes talking about our fears, she added with a hesitant smile. They both knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were willing to face it together. The conversations about the future became more frequent and deeper. One night, while having dinner, David opened his heart. I've always imagined being a father, he confessed in a soft voice. Not because I want a mini-me, but because I want to share everything I've learned, all the things I love. He looked at Sarah, waiting for her reaction. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his expectation. I understand, David, she began, carefully choosing her words. I've always been afraid of losing our freedom, of how things would change if we had kids. But after what happened with Lizzie, I started to think that maybe it's not so scary after all. She smiled, trying to ease the tension. David held her hand, his eyes shining with hope. Would you really consider it? He asked cautiously. Sarah nodded, feeling an unexpected calmness. Yes, I think I would. I still have my fears, but maybe we can explore this possibility together. David, grinning from ear to ear, couldn't contain his excitement. I promise we won't rush into anything, he said, squeezing her hand. The important thing is that we're on the same team. To strengthen their bond, the couple began looking for new activities they could enjoy together. David decided to teach Sarah about electronics, an old passion of his. It's like magic, he said, showing her how to connect wires and create simple circuits. Sarah, fascinated, tried to understand the new world unfolding before her. It's amazing how these tiny things can make a light bulb turn on, she commented, laughing at her initial ignorance. Sarah, in turn, introduced David to some of her favorite novels. Let's start with Pride and Prejudice, she said, handing him a copy of Jane Austen's book. David raised an eyebrow but accepted the challenge. I admit, it's more interesting than I expected, he said after a few nights of reading. Their discussions about the characters and plots became a new way for them to connect. One night, as they talked about what they had learned from each other, Sarah made a suggestion she never thought she would. David, what if we tried to have a child? David looked at her, stunned. Are you sure? He asked, trying not to sound too eager. Sarah nodded, smiling. We don't have all the answers right now, but I think I'm ready to consider it. David, overcome with emotion, hugged her tightly. Whatever happens, the most important thing is that we're in this together, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Amanda was finally discharged from the hospital and returned home, accompanied by Julia and Carlos. Returning home brought a mix of emotions for everyone. For Amanda, it was a relief to be in her own space again, surrounded by memories and comfort. For Julia, it was a chance to start anew, now with the full truth of her origins revealed. For Carlos, it was a sign that a new chapter was beginning for them all. On their first night back, Amanda suggested a special dinner to celebrate her recovery and the start of a new path. The table was set with elegant simplicity, reflecting Amanda's modest lifestyle. As they ate, the conversation was light, filled with laughter and stories of the past. But there was an underlying current of something deeper, a sense that they were all ready to move forward in a new way. After dinner, they sat in the living room enjoying a glass of wine. Amanda, watching Julia and Carlos, felt a wave of happiness and peace. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she said, smiling at them both. "You two are perfect for each other." Julia and Carlos exchanged glances, and she smiled shyly. "I feel like we've found something special," Julia admitted, holding Carlos' hand. "Something that grew through everything we've been through." Carlos nodded, looking fondly at Julia. "I feel the same, and I'm excited to see where this takes us," he said, squeezing her hand tenderly. Amanda, moved, raised her glass. "To love, to family, and to a bright future," she toasted, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. "And to the new adventures that await us." With Roger out of their lives, the inheritance destined for philanthropic projects, and a new understanding of their personal stories, each of them was ready for a fresh start. Julia, inspired by the values Amanda had instilled in her, began working on social projects with renewed passion. She wanted to ensure that her mother's legacy was honored in a meaningful way and began collaborating with local organizations to improve education and healthcare services. Carlos, alongside Julia, continued his work at the hospital, but now with a new perspective. He felt that, alongside Julia, he could truly make a difference, not only in the lives of patients but also in the community at large. Together, they began planning community health programs focused on preventive education and psychological support. The hospital, which had been the setting for so many difficult moments and shocking revelations, now stood as a symbol of rebirth and hope. Amanda, Julia, and Carlos were ready to face the future, strengthened by their love and determination to do good. As they walked together toward this new horizon, each carried with them the lessons of the past and the hope for a better future. The love, trust, and resilience they had developed together were the solid foundation on which they would build their lives going forward. And so, with intertwined hearts and a clear vision of what they wanted for the future, they moved forward, ready to build a life filled with meaning, happiness, and purpose.